The night my husband introduced me as his assistant to a room full of 200 people, I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I stood there in the black dress I'd bought specifically for his gallery opening, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, and I smiled. That smile cost me everything I had left. My name is Maya. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 6 years, I have been a physical therapist at Riverside Medical Center in Portland, Oregon. I have worked double shifts, picked up weekend hours, and eaten lunch at my desks more times than I can count. Not because I had to, because my husband, Julian, needed me to. When I met Julian, he was 29 and brilliant and broke. He had an MFA in fine arts and a portfolio full of work that genuinely took your breath away. Large-scale photography installations that dealt with memory and erasures. With the way time hollows things out. I fell in love with him the way you fall in love with something rare. Carefully at first, then completely. We married in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard in Eugene. 40 people, string lights. My grandmother's recipe for lemon cake. Julian cried when I walked toward him, and I thought, I actually believed, that was the truest thing I had ever seen. The first years were tight. He was building his name, applying for grants, doing commissions that barely covered materials. I supported us. Fully. My salary paid our rent, our groceries, his studio space on Belmont Street, his equipment, the trips to New York when he had meetings with gallery reps. I never kept a tally. That's what you do when you love someone. You don't keep score. By year 4, things started to shift for him. A group show in San Francisco, a write-up in Art Forum, a commission from a tech company in Seattle that paid more than I made in 3 months. I was proud of him in a way that felt almost physical, like warmth behind the sternum. What I didn't notice, or maybe what I chose not to notice, was how I was slowly becoming background. He started going to more events without me. Networking, he said. The art world runs on relationships. I understood. I told him I understood. I was tired most nights anyway, on my feet 8 hours treating patients with spinal injuries and post-surgical rehab, and the thought of dressing up and making small talk with strangers honestly sounded exhausting. But that's how it happens, isn't it? You make reasonable compromises until the compromises become the whole shape of your life. I found out about Renata the way you find out about most things you weren't supposed to know. By accident. I was looking for a charge cable in Julian's jacket pocket, and I found a receipt from a restaurant on NW 23rd. Ox, which is not the kind of place you go by yourself. The date was a Thursday 2 weeks prior. Julian had told me he'd had a client dinner in Vancouver that night. I didn't confront him right away. I want to be honest about that. I told myself there was probably an explanation. I'm a logical person. I deal in bodies and recovery, in measurable progress, in objective data. I needed more than one receipt. I got more. A text thread I saw when his phone lit up while he was in the shower. A name I didn't recognize. Renata. The preview said, only can't stop thinking about Thursday. I put his phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood at the sink for a long time with the water running. I knew who Renata was, I realized. He'd mentioned her months ago as someone he'd known in grad school. An artist herself. Sculpture, I thought he'd said. Beautiful. From the one photo I'd seen on his Instagram, where she had appeared in a group shot at some opening he'd attended without me. What I felt in that moment was not what I expected. I expected rage. What I felt inst was a kind of cold, spreading clarity, like a window being cleaned from the outside. I said nothing. I made dinner. We ate together, and Julian talked about a new project he was developing, something about architectural erosion, and I nodded and asked questions and listened. And the whole time I was thinking, how long? How long has this been the real shape of things? The gallery opening was 3 weeks later. It was the biggest event of Julian's career to date. The Morrison Contemporary Gallery in the Pearl District, a full solo show, 32 pieces, a catalog, a reception with collectors and critics, and Portland's entire art establishment crammed into a beautiful white-walled space on a Friday night in October. Julian had been preparing for it for 18 months. I had watched him build it from nothing. I had listened to every doubt, every late-night crisis of confidence, every revision to the artist's statement. I wore the black dress. I had my hair done, something I almost never do. I took a cab so I could have a glass of wine. When I arrived, Julian was across the room talking to a group of people I didn't recognize. He saw me come in. He raised his hand in a brief wave, the kind you give an acquaintance, and turned back to his conversation. I told myself that was fine. He was working the room. This was his night. The trouble started about 40 minutes in. I was standing near one of the large prints, a A photograph of a demolished building in Detroit, the wallpaper still visible through the exposed brick, somebody's floral pattern surviving in the wreckage. When a collector named Douglas introduced himself to me and asked how I knew the artist. "I'm his wife," I said. Douglas looked surprised in a way that told me everything. "Oh," he said carefully. He mentioned he had help with the logistics. I didn't realize. "Help with the logistics," I said. "The studio management. The grant applications." He must have seen something in my face, 'cause he stopped. "I'm sorry. Maybe I misunderstood." I excused myself. I moved through the crowd toward Julian, who was now standing with a small group near the far wall, and next to him was Renata. I knew her immediately from the Instagram photo, but she looked different in person. Taller, with dark hair pulled back and a kind of easy confidence in the way she stood next to my husband that made my stomach drop. A woman from the gallery's PR team, Bridget, I would later learn, was trying to organize a group photograph. Several collectors, the gallery director, Julian. Bridget motioned toward the group, and I stepped forward. Julian put his hand on my arm. "Not the way you take someone's hand, the way you stop them. Can you grab me a water?" he said quietly. "I'm parched." I looked at him. "Maya." His voice was careful, neutral. "Please." He steered me, gently, firmly, with that hand on my arm, a half step back, and the photograph happened without me. Julian stood beside Renata. She was laughing at something. He was smiling. The smile I had thought was mine. I went and got his water. I stood at the drinks table for I don't know how long. A minute. 5 minutes. I set the water glass down on the table very slowly and precisely the way you set down something fragile. Then I walked to the coat check, retrieved my jacket, and left. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dashboard. I was not crying. I was waiting to see what I would feel, and what I felt was that spreading cold clarity again. Except this time it was accompanied by something else. It was decision. I drove home. I did not answer Julian's text when they came in. First a question mark, then, "Where are you?" Then something about how I'd embarrassed him by leaving. I put my phone on the kitchen counter, and I sat down at the table in my good black dress in my quiet house, and I thought for a long time. I thought about 6 years. About the double shifts. About the studio rent on Belmont Street. And the New York flights. And the equipment and the grant applications I had proofread at midnight while Julian slept. I thought about a text message preview that said, "Can't stop thinking about Thursday." I thought about a collector named Douglas telling me Julian had mentioned he'd had help with the logistics. I was help with the logistics. Julian came home at 1 in the morning. He smelled like wine, and he was sharp when he found me still at the kitchen table. "You walked out," he said. "Do you have any idea what tonight meant to me? Do you know how that looked?" "How what looked?" I said. "You disappearing. In the middle of my opening." I looked at him for a moment. "You asked me to get your water so you could be in a photo with Renata. That is not." I needed a second, Maya. There were collectors there. "Douglas told me you described me as someone who helped with the logistics." Julian opened his mouth, closed it. "That's not. I was explaining the production side of your life," I said. "You were explaining the production side of your life. And I am on the production side." He slept in the guest room. Or said he would. I didn't check. I lay in our bed and stared at the ceiling and understood, with a completeness that almost felt peaceful, that I was done. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a person who acts on emotion. In my work, acting on emotion gets people hurt. You assess, you document, you build a plan, you follow the plan. So that's what I did. The first call I made the following Monday was to a family law attorney named Patricia. I found her through a colleague at the hospital. I did not cry in her office. I told her the facts. The finances, the timeline, the structure of how our money had worked for the past 6 years. She listened carefully, and at the end she said, "You have a strong case for consideration of financial contribution in the asset division." I asked her to explain what that meant in plain terms. "It means," she said, "that the jury of this situation will likely agree that you built what he has." I nodded. I told her to get started. The second thing I did was stop. I stopped covering for him at events we'd been invited to together. I stopped managing the calendar of studio appointments he had stored in our shared Google account. I stopped reminding him about the quarterly tax filing. Quietly, without announcement. I just stopped. He didn't notice for 2.5 weeks. The third thing I took longer to decide. In Julian's studio, in our studio, technically, since my name was on the lease, because his credit was bad when we'd signed it 6 years ago, there was a cabinet in the corner where he kept what he called his archive. Physical prints, contact sheets, early experimental work. And in that cabinet, in a flat file drawer, was a sketchbook. Not one of his current sketchbooks. This was the first one. I had bought it for him on our third date. We had walked through Powell's books together on a rainy Saturday, and he had stopped in the art supply section and picked it up and turned it over and set it back down. And I had gone back and bought it while he was looking at something else. Hardbound, black cover, 9 by 12. I gave it to him 2 weeks later on his birthday. That sketchbook was in the glass case at the Morrison Gallery. Framed and lit, presented as the origin point of the work. The placard beside it read, "The Beginning." I saw it the night of the opening, before everything happened. I had stood in front of it for a moment and felt something I couldn't quite name. Proud and sad in equal measure, the way you feel when something you were part of has outgrown you. 3 weeks after the opening, I went to the studio with my key. This was still legal. My name was still on the lease. I went on a Tuesday morning when Julian had a meeting across town. I opened the cabinet. I opened the flat file drawer. I took the sketchbook. I did not destroy it. I am not Stella. I brought it home and put it in the box of things that were mine. My grandmother's photo albums, the physical therapy license framed on the wall of the home office. A small watercolor my college roommate had painted for me years ago. Mine. Julian called that night. He had gotten to the studio in the afternoon. "Where is it?" he said. "Where is what?" "Maya." His voice was tight. "The sketchbook, the black one. It was in the flat file." "Oh," I said. "That one. I think I remember that. I bought that, didn't I? On our third date, I went back to Powell's." Silence. "I thought I should keep it," I said. "Since it's mine." That's in the show, Maya. "The gallery has it on loan," I told them. "I'll need you to let the gallery know it's been recalled by the owner." He lost his composure then. He raised his voice and said things I won't repeat. I waited until he was finished. "Julian," I said, "I would encourage you to call your own attorney. Patricia at Harmon Family Law has already been in contact with yours." He had not yet known I had an attorney. The silence after I said that was the first time in 6 years. I felt like I was standing on level ground. What came next was not fast or clean or satisfying in the way that stories sometimes imply. Divorce is paperwork and waiting and bureaucratic grinding that has nothing cinematic about it. There were mediation sessions, there were spreadsheets. There were weeks when I came home from the hospital after 10 hours on my feet and had to sit at the kitchen table with financial documents and try to make my exhausted brain do math. But Patricia was good at her job. She built the case methodically. 6 years of financial records. The tax returns that showed my income covering the household while Julian's studio operated at a loss, the lease agreements, the grant applications, with my fingerprints. All over the administrative sections. Julian had a lawyer too, a man named Weston who I'll say fought hard for Julian, which was his job. The settlement took 4 months to finalize. I won't list every line item. What matters is this: the studio on Belmont Street, which I had financed for 6 years, became mine. Julian was given 90 days to find alternative space. A portion of the proceeds, from any sale of work created during our marriage, the period during which my income had primarily supported the household, was allocated to me. The Morrison Gallery show, which had been sold through with significant collector interest while we were in mediation, had generated enough that the settlement figure was not negligible. Renata and Julian moved in together in January. I found this out from a mutual acquaintance, not from Julian, and I found that I felt approximately nothing when I heard it, which itself felt like information. The sketchbook is on my bookshelf. I look at it sometimes when I come home from work. It's not about anger, and it stopped being about grief somewhere around the 3rd month of mediation. It's more like a reminder of what I'm capable of building, of the fact that I built it. I'm still at Riverside Medical Center. I picked up a continuing education course in sports rehabilitation, and I'm working toward a specialization. I got a dog, a 3-year-old beagle mix from the Oregon Humane Society named Hank, who is opinionated about where he sleeps and has strong feelings about the sound of the coffee grinder, and is the best decision I have made in years. I went to my parents' house in Eugene for Christmas. My mother hugged me for a long time in the kitchen and didn't say much, which is how she expresses the things that matter. My father took me for a walk through the neighborhood after dinner, in the cold, and said, "You've always known how to take care of things." I didn't answer right away. We walked I'm learning, I said. There's something I want to say to anyone who's listening to this and recognizing something. Not about leaving. Not about what to do, because I'm not qualified to tell anyone what to do about their own life. But about that feeling. That spreading, cold clarity I mentioned. The moment when you understand the actual shape of things instead of the shape you've been hoping for. That feeling is information. Don't argue with it. Don't explain it away. Let it tell you what it knows. I still think about the night I stood in front of that drinks table, with Julian's water glass, and understood that I was being managed out of my own marriage. I think about the 40 people in my parents' backyard in Eugene, the string lights, my grandmother's lemon cake. The way Julian cried. I think about the sketchbook. Powell's book still has a whole section of them. Same brand, same size, black hardbound, 9 by 12. I walked past it last fall. I go to Powell's sometimes on Saturday mornings now, just by myself, coffee in hand, and I stopped in front of the shelf and stood there for a moment. I didn't buy one, but I could have. That's the thing. I walked on, and Hank was waiting at home, and there was work I liked, and a life I was rebuilding from the ground up, and I thought, not with sadness, but with something that felt almost like relief, that the next sketchbook I fill would be entirely, unmistakably mine.